What if a young girl, claiming to hear divine voices, became the savior of a nation? What if those voices urged her to don armor, brandish a blade, and lead troops against a mighty empire, despite her being uneducated, impoverished, and unknown? Would you trust her claims, or condemn her to the flames? Welcome to Mythic Chronicles, where ancient tales, hidden terrors, and epic supernatural battles are brought to life. If you're fascinated by the obscure corners of mythology, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with every epic tale. In 1412, in the tranquil hamlet of Domrémy in northeastern France, a girl named Jeanne was born to the humble family of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy. She entered a world ravaged by conflict, as France was torn apart by a war that had raged for generations. The notorious 100 Years' War, a savage struggle between England and France, erupted when England's King Edward III claimed the French throne after King Charles IV's death without an heir. The French rejected the notion of an English ruler, leading to relentless bloodshed that left France in ashes. In this turmoil, Jeanne was raised. The youngest of 5 children, she grew up in a devout, though poor, household steadfast in its religious practices. Life in Domrémy was modest, herding sheep, weaving wool, and attending church. Jeanne never learned to read or write, her hands were shaped for labor, not literature. Yet her spiritual insight was as keen as the sword she would later wield. A villager later testified in the Procès de Jeanne d'Arc, 1456, that she seemed destined for greatness. Everything shifted when Jeanne was just 13. One day, in the stillness of her father's garden, she claimed to hear a voice, not earthly, but heavenly, coming from the direction of the village church, serene and luminous. She later identified it as Saint Michael the Archangel, joined over time by Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These were no mere dreams, Jeanne maintained, but vivid, divine visions, clear and commanding. Procès de condamnation, 1431. The message was staggering. She was chosen to save France, lead its forces, and expel the English invaders. Picture the enormity of such a calling, entrusted not to a seasoned warrior or noble, but to a peasant girl who had never ventured beyond her village. Initially, even her family doubted her. Yet Jeanne's resolve was unshakable, rooted in faith stronger than skepticism. With a relative's husband's aid, she journeyed to Vaucouleurs to meet Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander, seeking an audience with the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to France's throne. Baudricourt, unsurprisingly, scoffed at her, a girl claiming divine military orders? Absurd. But Jeanne persisted, returning repeatedly for nearly a year until her determination wore down his doubts. He eventually sent her, under escort, to Chinon to meet the Dauphin. Here, history balanced on the brink of the miraculous. To test her, Charles disguised himself among his courtiers, believing that if Jeanne's guidance was truly divine, she would identify him without clues. And she did. Approaching the disguised Dauphin without hesitation, she greeted him as France's rightful king. Stunned, Charles listened, but divine claims required proof. Jeanne faced rigorous examinations to verify her purity, faith, and sanity. Noble women, including Queen Yolande of Aragon, confirmed her virginity, a symbol of spiritual integrity in the court's eyes. Then, at Poitiers, scholars and clerics interrogated her relentlessly. Their verdict: we find no fault in her, only devotion, sincerity, humility, chastity, and simplicity. Procès, 1429. Her faith had withstood scrutiny. Now, the battlefield awaited. Clad in armor and astride a white steed, Jean rode forth as France teetered under English domination. Her banner, adorned with the names Jesus and Maria, golden fleurs-de-lis, and Christ with an angel, was both a testament to her faith and a defiance of English might and French despair. Known as La Pucelle, the Maid, she had no title, no military training, no education. Yet, with the Dauphin's blessing and the wary trust of his generals, she was given command. The battlefield would determine if her divine mission could forge victory from ruin. Her first mission, Orleans, a city under siege, desperate for salvation. As Jean approached Orleans, the English soldiers were already mocking. Word had spread like fire, the French were being led by a peasant girl. To them, it was a sign of desperation, perhaps even madness. But when they saw her clad in white, surrounded by soldiers who no longer looked broken, they hesitated. In their contempt, they underestimated the power of belief. Jean did not speak of tactics or strategy. She spoke of God's will. If you do not leave peacefully, her letter to the English warned, you shall hear the cry of war. That cry echoed soon after. At the front, she led a charge toward the English-held outpost of St. Louis. During battle, she was struck by an arrow between her neck and shoulder. The wound was deep, but even as blood poured from her flesh, Jean refused to retreat. Her presence, bloodied and radiant, stirred the French soldiers to fury. They stormed the English defenses and seized victory. The English were stunned. They had laughed. Now they cursed her name. The French, once paralyzed by fear, surged forward with newfound purpose. Within days, Jean led the army in more assaults, striking fortifications with relentless determination. The siege of Orleans had become a war of will, and Jean's will seemed unbreakable. She did not wield a blade to kill, but her banner was always at the front where the arrows flew. In the chaos, her voice was clear and commanding. "Forward, brave soldiers," she cried, "do not flee when the Lord is with us." Those who doubted her now followed her with reverence. Men who had lost sons and fathers in the fields of Agincourt now fought like lions beside a teenage girl. Orleans was liberated within days. The English, humiliated, retreated. Jean entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a redeemer. She distributed food to the starving, ensured the soldiers were paid, and walked among the people with the same humility she had in Domrémy. Chronicler Jean Chartier described her thus: "She passed through the gates like an angel come to judge the wicked, yet with hands ready to heal the wounded." The transformation of the French army under her leadership was not just strategic. It was spiritual. No longer a force scattered by fear, it had become a storm driven by divine wind. But victory at Orleans was not enough. Jean pressed forward. The road to Reims, where Charles could be crowned, still lay in English-held territory. She urged him, "March forward while heaven still favors us." Her next test came at the fortified city of Jargeau. During the assault, she was again wounded, this time struck on the head by a stone while scaling a wall. Stunned but unbroken, she rose to her feet, and the French forces rallied behind her. The city fell. Then came Montserrat, then Beaugency. Jean was not merely a mascot. She was the catalyst of every triumph. The Battle of Patay became a turning point. Here, the French destroyed an English army, capturing their top commanders and killing hundreds. Jean's forces suffered minimal losses. For the English, who had once claimed divine right to rule France, the sight of a teenage girl leading their enemies to victory was unbearable. They whispered of witchcraft, of demons. But to the French, Jean's success only confirmed her divine calling. If not sent by God, wrote chronicler Perceval de Cagny, then why did the heavens obey her voice? Now, with the path cleared, Jean and her army led Charles to Reims. The city opened its gates willingly. On the 17th day of July, inside the great cathedral, Charles was anointed and crowned King of France. Jean stood nearby, weeping. Her mission, as declared by the voices she obeyed, had been fulfilled. She had not sought glory. She did not ask for land or title. She merely bowed and whispered, "Now, O Lord, let thy servant depart in peace." According to the Chronique de la Pucelle, the moment was so moving that many among the crowd fell to their knees. But peace was not Jean's destiny. Her enemies grew more determined, and within the court she had helped to crown, jealousy and politics began to stir. She was a threat not just to the English, but to those who envied her rise. For now, the light still burned, but the shadows were closing in. We called her mad, yet she led us to victory. We called her a witch, yet she prayed like a saint. And when she bled, we followed her, not because of her sword, but because she believed more fiercely than we ever did. The coronation of Charles at Reims, achieved through the persistence and divine conviction of a peasant girl, should have marked a turning point for France. Yet, as quickly as Jean's star had risen, the political winds shifted. The royal court, which had once relied on her zeal, began to fear her influence. Charles, now crowned, turned his focus toward diplomacy and consolidation rather than continued war. Many nobles and clergy, who had tolerated Jean's unorthodox presence out of necessity, began to distance themselves. The Maid had become too powerful, too symbolic, an uncontrollable force that neither court nor clergy could fully claim. And so, her calls for further campaigns to free occupied cities were met not with enthusiasm, but silence. Despite the court's hesitation, Jean remained faithful to her mission. She refused to abandon the battlefield while the enemy still occupied French soil. Gathering what troops she could without full royal support, she marched to defend the city of Compiègne, now threatened by the Burgundians, allies of the English. The situation was grim. The Burgundian army outnumbered her forces, and the French crown had offered no reinforcements. Still, she fought. On the field, she was tireless, charging with her banner raised high. But during a chaotic skirmish outside the city gates, her troops were forced into retreat. As she covered their escape, Jean was surrounded. The gates of Compiègne closed behind her. She was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the Duke of Luxembourg. From that moment, her fate was sealed, not by sword or battle, but by betrayal and political calculation. The Burgundians saw in Jean a valuable prize. Her captor, seeking favor and coin, sold her to the English. The transaction was not only a condemnation of Jean, but a political blow to the French king, who had done nothing to rescue the woman who had won him his crown. Now in English hands, Jean was a dangerous symbol. To destroy her, they could not simply kill her. They needed to discredit her completely. The path chosen was the darkest imaginable, a trial not of justice, but of heresy. If they could prove that she had lied about her visions, if they could claim her voices were demonic, then the victories she inspired would become curses, and her memory would rot in shame. The girl who had saved a kingdom would be remembered as a witch. Imprisoned in the castle of Rouen, Jean was held in harsh conditions. Her cell was cold, damp, and guarded not by nuns or matrons, but by male soldiers, an indignity condemned even by the Church's own laws. She had no advocate, no defender. The trial was orchestrated by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a man loyal to the English crown. Jean asked for her case to be brought before the Pope in Rome, a right every Christian was entitled to. Her request was ignored. From the beginning, the outcome was predetermined. She would be condemned. The trial, which began in January, dragged on for months. Her interrogators questioned her relentlessly, probing for contradictions, theological errors, anything that could be used to accuse her of heresy, witchcraft, or fraud. But Jean did not break. Time and again, she answered with clarity and conviction. When asked whether the voices she heard were from God, she replied, "They are more real than you, and I would trust them above all men." When pressed about wearing male clothing, she insisted it was for protection among male guards and that she had divine permission to do so. According to the procès de condamnation, the judges grew increasingly frustrated with her responses. One chronicler noted, "She confounded her accusers not with cunning, but with unshakable faith." On the rare occasions when she faltered, it was not from fear, but exhaustion. She endured threats of torture and excommunication. Yet she never denied her visions, never betrayed her mission. Her courage inside that cell echoed louder than on any battlefield. The trial took a darker turn when the court demanded a public recantation. Desperate to avoid the flames, and exhausted from her captivity, Jean signed a confession, likely without fully understanding it. She was sentenced to life in prison. But the English were not satisfied. Days later, when she was found again in male clothing, an act she explained was forced upon her, her sentence was overturned. She was declared a relapsed heretic. The punishment for this, according to the laws of the Church, was death by fire. The verdict was not justice. It was execution disguised in the robe of doctrine. The girl who had led an army and crowned a king would now be bound to a stake by the same powers that once cheered her name. On a gray morning in late May, the narrow streets of Rouen stirred with grim anticipation. Soldiers, clergy, and townspeople gathered near the old marketplace, where a wooden stake had been raised high above the cobblestones. Around it, bundles of dry wood had been carefully stacked. It was not the site of a coronation or a battlefield, but of a judgment, a cruel theater where power would be exercised through flame. Jean, dressed in a simple tunic, was led from her cell by guards. Her hands were bound, her head shorn. The once proud banner of France's divine warrior was now a prisoner's rag. Yet, even in chains, there was something unshaken in her bearing. Those who walked with her later swore she did not tremble. At the base of the scaffold, Bishop Cauchon read aloud the charges: heresy, idolatry, blasphemy, sorcery. The crowd, once stirred by her victories, now watched in silence, their faces stiff with fear or shame. As the bishop concluded, he gestured to the executioner. Jean was led to the stake, and rope secured her to the wooden post. A soldier tied a wooden cross to her chest. She had asked for one, and when no priest would bring it, an English soldier fashioned it from sticks. Witnesses said she kissed it. At the last moment, as flames were prepared to be lit, she cried for a priest to hold a crucifix before her eyes. Friar Isambard de la Pierre stepped forward and granted her request. "Hold it high," she begged, "so I may see it through the smoke." Procès de condamnation, May 1431. When the fire was lit, it spread quickly. Flames curled around her legs, licking at the base of the pyre. The crowd could hear her voice above the crackle of burning wood. She called the name Jesus again and again, over and over, until the smoke choked her breath. Eyewitnesses testified that she never screamed, never cursed, never begged for her life. One English soldier was seen weeping. A secretary to the English king reportedly muttered, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." The executioner, terrified by what he had done, later confessed to a priest that he feared eternal damnation. After the fire consumed her body, the executioners scattered her ashes in the river Seine. It was not enough to kill her. They wanted to erase her. But memory has a way of surviving what fire cannot destroy. Though Jean's body was gone, her story remained. In the years that followed, questions began to rise. Why had the French king done nothing to intervene? Why had the church allowed political powers to dictate a religious trial? In private, many clergymen who had remained silent during the trial began to express regret. The court that condemned her had been handpicked by the English and their allies with no impartiality. Her so-called confession had been signed under duress and possibly without understanding its content. More and more, her death looked not like justice, but like murder under the guise of holy judgment. Years later, political tides began to shift. France, inspired by the victories Jean had ignited, continued to recover lost territory. Charles, the king she had crowned, eventually authorized an investigation into the trial that had led to her execution. Perhaps guilt weighed upon him, or perhaps public pressure demanded a reckoning. In the year 1456, a retrial was opened, now known as the Procès de Réhabilitation. Dozens of witnesses, soldiers, clergy, villagers, even former enemies, testified in her defense. The transcripts reveal a stunning reversal. She had been honest, pious, brave, and deeply faithful. The court concluded that the original trial had been corrupt, politically motivated, and entirely unjust. Her name was cleared, and she was declared innocent of all charges. Recognition, however, came slowly. It would take centuries for the Church to fully embrace her legacy. In the 19th century, as France struggled to forge a national identity, Jean became a symbol of unity, neither purely religious nor entirely secular, but a bridge between the divine and the human. Napoleon called her the embodiment of patriotic courage. Writers and artists depicted her as a martyr. In the early 20th century, the Catholic Church formally beatified her. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, Pope Benedict XV canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. A girl once burned as a heretic was now honored as a saint. Her legacy, sealed not by crown or sword, but by endurance through the centuries. And this maid, simple and pure, who had no learning and no power, stood before kings and judges, and spoke with the certainty of one who feared no man. In her silence was more truth than in all their books. In the years following Jean's execution, the flames that had consumed her body seemed to ignite something deeper in the conscience of France. Her death had silenced her voice, but her absence echoed louder than her presence ever had. Whispers turned to questions, and questions into unrest. How had the woman who led armies, reclaimed cities, and crowned a king been abandoned so completely? Why had no sword been raised, no word spoken from Charles himself in her defense? Those who had once cheered her in the streets of Reims now spoke of her with reverence, sorrow, and guilt. Her ashes, scattered in the Seine, became a symbol not of her destruction, but of the shame of those who allowed it to happen. For decades, Jean's name was spoken in hushed tones. Among the people, she was remembered not as a heretic, but as a martyr. In churches, quiet prayers were offered in her memory. Though no altar bore her image, her family, particularly her mother Isabel and her brother Pierre, carried the weight of her loss, not only as kin, but as witnesses to a grave injustice. Isabel, aging and widowed, devoted her final years to restoring her daughter's name. She petitioned the church, appealed to bishops, and sought audiences with any authority that would listen. She was not a witch, she said, according to the documented petitions from the mid-15th century. She was my child, and she was chosen by God. The strength of a mother's grief would become one of the cornerstones of Jean's path to rehabilitation. Public memory began to shift in earnest when the tide of war finally turned. France, rallying under the very crown Jean had secured, began to push back English forces. The nation slowly reclaimed its land, its strength, and, in time, its pride. What if a young girl, claiming to hear divine voices, became the savior of a nation? What if those voices urged her to don armor, brandish a blade, and lead troops against a mighty empire, despite her being uneducated, impoverished, and unknown? Would you trust her claims, or condemn her to the flames? Welcome to Mythic Chronicles, where ancient tales, hidden terrors, and epic supernatural battles are brought to life. If you're fascinated by the obscure corners of mythology, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with every epic tale. In 1412, in the tranquil hamlet of Domrémy in northeastern France, a girl named Jean was born to the humble family of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee. She entered a world ravaged by conflict, as France was torn apart by a war that had raged for generations. The notorious 100 Years' War, a savage struggle between England and France, erupted when England's King Edward III claimed the French throne after King Charles IV's death without an heir. The French rejected the notion of an English ruler, leading to relentless bloodshed that left France in ashes. In this turmoil, Jean was raised. The youngest of 5 children, she grew up in a devout, though poor, household steadfast in its religious practices. Life in Domrémy was modest, herding sheep, weaving wool, and attending church. Jean never learned to read or write, her hands were shaped for labor, not literature. Yet her spiritual insight was as keen as the sword she would later wield. A villager later testified in the Procès de Jeanne d'Arc, 1456, that she seemed destined for greatness. Everything shifted when Jean was just 13. One day, in the stillness of her father's garden, she claimed to hear a voice, not earthly, but heavenly, coming from the direction of the village church, serene and luminous. She later identified it as Saint Michael the Archangel, joined over time by Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These were no mere dreams, Jean maintained, but vivid, divine visions, clear and commanding. Procès de condamnation, 1431. The message was staggering. She was chosen to save France, lead its forces, and expel the English invaders. Picture the enormity of such a calling, entrusted not to a seasoned warrior or noble, but to a peasant girl who had never ventured beyond her village. Initially, even her family doubted her. Yet Jean's resolve was unshakable, rooted in faith stronger than skepticism. With a relative's husband's aid, she journeyed to Vaucouleurs to meet Robert de Baudricourt, the local commander, seeking an audience with the Dauphin, the uncrowned heir to France's throne. Baudricourt, unsurprisingly, scoffed at her, a girl claiming divine military orders? Absurd. But Jean persisted, returning repeatedly for nearly a year until her determination wore down his doubts. He eventually sent her, under escort, to Chinon to meet the Dauphin. Here, history balanced on the brink of the miraculous.